We took our first steps when it comes to styling by assigning properties and values for the properties. Now, the next step is to ensure that we don't apply the same styles all over our page. Sometimes you want this. Sometimes you want every H1 tag to look the same. For example, when it comes to its font size, that's a pretty common thing. But sometimes, like in this case, you don't want that. Semantically, we got two H1 tags, but they should look different here. Now, right now, we always select the same section and the same H1 tag. Thankfully, we have more than just the tag selectors which we're currently using in CSS. So let's see which other selectors we have. We did have a look at the so-called element or tag selectors. There, we set the equal styles for all these elements, and it looks like this. In HTML, we got a couple of elements, and the H1 tag here would have a red text because of this rule. We select the H1 tag, and we assign a color of red. Now that is what we saw thus far, but there is more. For example, we also have class selectors. Classes are something you might have never heard before because they are a concept strongly connected to CSS. With classes, we can define a style which we then apply to all elements that have the same class. And a class is added to an element in HTML by adding the class attribute, as you can see here. In this snippet, all the elements actually have the blog post class. Now, the blog post class is not something which is predefined by the browser. You define classes instead. In CSS, the code would look like this. Please notice that this selector is a bit different than the tag selector. It starts with a dot and then your class name. And you're free to choose any class name you want. Here, the color is then also set to red. That's the declaration in that rule. And therefore, all HTML elements that have this class will get the red text color. Now, sometimes you also want to set a certain style for all elements on the entire page. And in this case, you have the universal selector. So here's an example where we have one element without a class and one with a class. And let's say the top two rules wouldn't exist. So the only rule we could then add to turn everything red would be this one. With the star selector, you style every element on your page. And to be honest, you rarely use this one. The reason is you rarely want to have the same style on every single element on your page. There is one specific use case, we'll also have a look at later though, where this makes sense. Now we're not done yet though. There are two other kinds of important selectors. ID selectors, for example, allow you to select elements by the ID they have and then apply a style to that one specific element. Since an ID only exists once on a page, we only apply the style to one single element. In HTML, it would look something like this. Here we have an H1 tag with an ID, main title in this case. The ID, of course, can be anything you want. And then in CSS, you would target it by adding a hashtag in front of the ID name. And then again, you define the rule, so the declarations for that rule to be precise. And this would turn this text red in this snippet here. Now, the last type of selector, of main selectors you have, are attribute selectors. There you select HTML elements by the attribute they have, and this again can select multiple elements, unlike the ID selector, which only selected one. Here, you set the equal style to all elements with the same attributes. In HTML, here we would have a button with the disabled attribute, a standard HTML button attribute you can set. And in CSS, you would select all buttons or all elements with the disabled attribute by enclosing the attribute name in square brackets, that's just the syntax CSS uses, and then assigning your declarations. So this CSS code would assign a red text to all elements, no matter if they're buttons or not, which have a disabled attribute. This is a little bit of theory. We will see all these selectors throughout the course. Thus far, we only used the element selector, but maybe one or multiple of the other selectors can help us with our problem of styling the things we have on our page right now differently. So back in our code, right now we only use the element selector. Section H1, these are element selectors. Now I said I want to have different styles. So for example, what we could do is we could assign IDs to these sections. We could add an ID here to the first section and maybe name it product-overview. The name of the ID is totally up to you. Now, IDs are not an attribute which you only add because you want to style the element. IDs also allow you to add a hashtag at the end of your URL, and the browser will immediately jump down to that element in the page, so it will scroll down there, so to say. But they can also be used for styling, as you will see. Let's also assign an ID to the second section. Maybe let's call this one plans, because I plan on adding my plans here, so the plans the user may choose from. So now we got two IDs, and this allows us to adjust our rules. Instead of selecting a section and setting the background to this color, I only want to do this for the first section, which has the ID of product overview. So let's copy that ID name and let's replace this section element selector here with the hashtag product overview selector. If we now save both files, so CSS and HTML, and we reload the page, you see the second one seems to be gone, but actually the text is just white still, so we don't see it. But the first one now is the only one with the reddish background. This already shows us a big advantage of using different selectors. The ID selector only matches elements with that ID, and semantically an ID should only occur once on a page, so it only selects this section and therefore only applies the styles there. Now if we want to have a different style for the second section, we could of course target it with that plans ID. However, for the second section, for now I actually don't want to change the section as a whole, just the h1 tag. Now there are actually multiple ways of getting access to this h1 tag in the second section. One way we can do it is by adding a class to the h1 tag. So let's add a class by adding the class attribute, and let's name it section-title. Again, the class name is up to you, though I do recommend that you pick class names which, first of all, use the kebab case, so where you have lowercase names where the words are separated with dashes. This is important because CSS is case insensitive, so something like section title written like this, which is readable to humans, is the same like section title like this, and therefore it can be harder to ensure you're not overwriting class names. Hence, kebab case is recommended. And the second thing which is important about classes is you can reuse them. Unlike IDs, you don't just use them once. You can add them multiple times, and a class is always a good choice if there is a decent chance of you reusing it. Otherwise, an ID might maybe be better, though you can always use classes if you want. Here, I defined my class, the name is up to you, and with that we can go to the main.css file, and I'll leave that h1 selector for now, but I'll also add a third selector now with a dot at the beginning and then the class name. This is a so-called class selector. And then in the rules set, I'll add a declaration where I set the color to another color. Here I'll use hashtag 2ddf5c. Another color I picked in advance. It's a nice green, which will be our main theme color of this project. If we now save both files, CSS and HTML, and we reload the page, now we actually see that the second h1 tag has that green color because we did use a different selector. Now on the slide I showed you, there were other selectors too, and we will encounter these throughout the course too. But for now, this is a great first step when it comes to ensuring that our things look differently. These selectors we use right now, the ID selector, the tag selector, and the class selector, are already three very important selectors, which you will see a lot in your CSS code.